Welcome back everybody to my channel, and today this is not a Malazan video. We're returning to this sort of series where I tell you which kind of books from the 1930s and so forth you should have read and sort of give you like a slight introduction into what I, among other people, think are classics of the fantasy fiction or fantastic fiction in general that have influenced tons of other authors and pop culture in general. And after dealing with Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian and Clark Ashton Smith in general, and before I'll do one on the rest of Howard, like the opus minor of Howard, so to speak, where I'll look into Call of Atlantis, Bran McMahon, Solomon Kane, and other stuff, I figured, because just feel like it, to actually talk today about one that is hugely influential in so many ways. That is Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse's stories, also known as the Lankamar stories or the Knave stories. Anyway, those that sort of make sword and sorcery for several reasons. And I'll gonna do this today. We'll see how long it'll get. It'll be rambly as usual. I'll give you like an introduction and everything. So let's do this. Cheers. All right. Now I'll try to structure it in a way by which I'll first, give a bit of info on who is Fritz Leiber, and then we continue into who are Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, what kind of thing are we talking here, like a short overview over the whole series, sort of. Then I'll pick out a few that I think are remarkable stories that, if you don't want to go into the whole thing, are the ones that I personally really enjoy and feel like encapsulate a lot of what makes the Fafhrd and Grey Mouse stories special or unique in a way. And then I'll wrap it up with like some general observations on influence, on Leiber's influence on contemporary fiction and contemporary pop culture in a way, that kind of thing. And maybe give like some past final thoughts on the whole thing. And that's what I'm trying to do today. We'll see how long that will take, if I can keep it under an hour or not. We'll see. So, who is Fritz Leiber? Well, first of all, he's Fritz Leiber Jr. That's how we start this. So his father is also called Fritz Leiber, and the elder Fritz Leiber was an actor, film and theater actor, had his own Shakespeare company at some point, and his mother was also an actress, and he grew up with them and spent some time in the theater, something that influenced his life, his writing, and other things. He was born in 1910 in Chicago, and he died in 1992 in California, in San Francisco, I believe. And so you already see he is probably one of the long-lived fantasy authors when it comes to like the 1930s stuff and pulp and sword and sorcery stuff. Although Jack Vance also lived to a ripe old age, but Jack Vance will be the focus of a different video, I suspect. He also dabbled in acting. He studied a while. He dabbled in acting, both movie and theater. He wrote, he worked as a journalist. He did all kinds of odd things over the years. Mostly he wrote stories. He went through several phases. He went to several genres. His focus, I would say, is mostly horror novels, horror short stories, mostly horror, a bit of science fiction in there, and then this long-going sword and sorcery series about his two heroes, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Those sort of span his whole writing career. The first Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's story was actually his first published story ever, from 1939, Two Sword Adventure. And the last Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's story was written and published in 1988, together with other stuff, in like shortly before his death. So those characters span his entire life in a way. What else is to be said about Fritz Leiber? He was also part of the whole 1940s, 50s science fiction and fantasy writers scene. He collaborated with people. He like he sort of spans, like, is one of those links between the 30s pulp era and later 1950s magazine science fiction era, all the way to like the birth of what I would consider like contemporary fantasy and science fiction culture with novels and stuff like that in the 80s and 90s. So that alone makes him a very interesting person to talk about. I mean, he started, in his like younger age, like in his mid-20s, he started a correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft before Lovecraft died. He worked together with Lynn Carter and founded the Sword and Sorcery Writers Club of America. Well, it's called something different, but that's kind of the thing. And there are rumors, legends, or whatever, that he actually is the first one who coined the term sword and sorcery for his stories in a way. But I couldn't find an actual reference. There's also discussion about whether you call him Liber or Liber. I go with Liber because I found an interview sequence from like the 1980s where he's asked at a convention about this, and he insists on it being Liber because of his German ancestors. Yeah. So those are most of the important things about his life. Yes, he struggled with alcoholism and other substance abuse in the 60s and 70s, mostly, apparently, after the death of his first wife and like these life crises. And there's stuff about that sort of in one of my favorite novels that we're not going to talk about here. I'll maybe make a video about it at some point when I start like making videos about books where I just yell at you to read books that are not contemporary, but also not actual classics, but I think people should read. And that would be Our Lady of Darkness, which is a fantastic book and kind of the book that Stephen King tried to write for decades, and in my King critical opinion, never managed to do. But yeah, I'll do a video on that. And if you pick up the book before that, yeah, go and pick up Our Lady of Darkness. It's actually fantastic. Other stuff that I've read includes the amazing Gather Darkness. It's like his first sort of novel, science fiction novel from the 1950s, which has witches fighting scientist priests and everyone and Satan taking part in it, or something like that. It has a really unique setting. It's not exactly the plot is not too complex or whatever. It definitely had some flaws when I read it for me, but the whole idea and setting was just really cool. Also, you have people like someone writing books in the 1950s where the heroes, the good guys, always say "Hail Satan." Well, "Hail Satanist," but pretty cool. Just saying. All right, so let's look at Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. As I said, it's a series of short stories, novellas, novelettes, vignettes, and so forth that span Leiber's entire writing career from 1939 to like the end of his career. And they are sword and sorcery, quintessential sword and sorcery stories, mostly set, almost exclusively set in the world of Newan. We're gonna get a big into that later on. And the two characters they feature are Fafhrd, a northern barbarian, and the Grey Mouser, a thief and rapier fencer, possibly from further south. Yes, they are fast friends, like, and most adventures they like almost all the time they have adventures together. So what's special about it? Well, first of all, Those two characters were, if Liber is to be believed, invented by his friend Harry Otto Fisher, and are modeled on Fisher and Liber, as like Liber apparently being like Fafhrd apparently being modeled on Liber, and the Mouser being modeled on Harry Otto Fisher. That's what I read. I've kind of, for a while I thought it was the other way around, but apparently I mistook that. Anyway, so they are sort of modeled on those two friends that stayed friends for a long time. And that's the other thing. Those characters kind of grow and age together with Liber. So what is super interesting at these stories is that from like those young heroes, those young adventurers, and most of those stories being written at the time when Liber himself was still relatively young, like in his mid-20s to mid-30s, all the way to like the end of Liber's life and the end of Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's careers. I'm not going to say lives here, but definitely the end of their, like, so you see like both the writing style age with Liber getting more experienced as a writer, and you see the characters mature both from a writing point of view and actual, like their fictional fictive biographies, they also get older. So that's a very unique thing that we have there that not many writers manage, because still, since the model is like not model, but the general way he writes is not one ongoing story, but similar like short stories, novellas. They are all like finished tales that are then placed within their ongoing life and biography. I remember when I spoke about Conan, it's like those stories don't follow Conan's like biography. Now we come to the publication of those Sword and Sorcery stories by Fritz Leiber, the Fafhrd and Grey Mouse stories. They were not all published in that order, but the main edition of that, and that's like another thing, is like the main edition of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouse stories was in 7 volumes. The so-called Swords series, they have all titles with the word sword in it, and since they were made and published during Liber's lifetime, it's him who orders them into like a fictional biography of his heroes in a way. Some of those, like most of them, are also in writing order or closely writing order, but not all of that. And those are like Swords and Deviltries, the first one, where we meet the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse. So we have like one story, origin story sort of Fafhrd and one of Grey Mouse, and then we have that amazing story Ill Met in Lankamar, which is definitely one that you should read, even if you don't read the first ones. And then we have the Swords Against Death, which is still really cool. Then we have Swords in the Mist, Swords Against Wizardry, or Swords and Wizardry, I keep forgetting. We have the Swords of Lankamar, which is a novel. Then we have Swords and Ice Magic. And finally, we have the Knight and Knave of Swords. And that's like the final one. And that one was published in, I believe, 1990, 1991, something like that. So from the first one being published in the 60s, I believe, being a collection of older stuff. And now that I've sort of outlined the publication history, I mean, there's also other publications you can find. Those 7 were made into an audiobook series of those 7 volumes with introductions by Neil Gaiman, which are the ones that I use, and they're really good. There's also some later omnibus editions where you have those 7 split into like 2 books or something. I think it's like a sci-fi, science fiction, fantasy masterworks did that, and some others did. And I guess if you find one of those are definitely the best way to go and the cheapest way to go if you want to go into that, because unlike some of Clark Ashton Smith and some of Robert E. Howard stuff, this is not yet free of copyright and freely available in a legal way online. So that would be my recommendation if you want to buy those books. And would say they are money well spent, especially if you get them for, I don't know, $10 to $20 per book, something like that, because there's a lot in there and it's a lot of fun. Not all of it's brilliant, but I guess next to Howard, you can say that probably Leiber has been the most influential writer in general, like one of the most influential writers for fantastic fiction over like nowadays, compared like outside of Tolkien, obviously, but for the more down to earth, dirtier fantasy stuff, Fritz Leiber has been hugely influential. And I'll get into why that is the case later on. So now, I guess it's time to look at stories that one should read or that I found extremely interesting or good. And for this, I want to follow the Swords series in a way. Even though the first, Two Salt Adventure, that first fabulous story from 39, only shows up in the second book, because like the first book, Swords and Deviltry, as I just said, is the two origin stories and that one story, Ilmet and Lankamar, which won a Hugo and a Nebula Award, and it details the first meeting of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. That one is definitely the best one of those three stories within that first book. The other two are good, don't get me wrong. The first one, The Snow Women, is Fafhrd's origin story, and it deals with his youth, or the end of his youth in the deep frozen north where he lives, and how he abandons like the culture, the stifling culture of his home clan, and leaves behind his then bride to be, who is already pregnant with his first child, and he leaves all of that behind for another woman and adventure and other things. Yes, you can already see those are rather gray heroes, both of them. And while Fafhrd is the more moral one most of the time, from his moral is a big word to use here. Fafhrd entertains notions of chivalry off and on, is how I would put it, if that makes any sense. Yes, so that's I don't want to spoil anything here, because yeah, that's not what this is about. Yeah, it's a good story. It's tells you a lot about, I guess, a lot about Fafhrd as a character. As I said, it deals with these ideas of coming of age, leaving behind a rather stifling, structured culture, and a life path that has already been set for you, and breaking out of that. It deals a lot with that. And it's solid work, is what I'm saying. The Unholy Grail is, on the other hand, is the Mouse's origin story. And it displays some things that are vital about the character of the Mouser, where Fafhrd is often driven by a more naive curiosity, at least at the beginning, and more an open character from his personality. The Mouse's story is a bit darker. He's apprenticed to a wizard, or sorcerer, hedge wizard kind of thing. There's a first love story in there as well. Generally, romance. I don't want to call it romance, but the relationship of those two heroes to women is a large element in all of those stories. And I would say a problematic one in a lot of ways, or at least something that nowadays comes across as problematic, but we'll talk about that more when we talk about how they've aged and about their influence and stuff like that. So yeah, young Mouser falls in love. It's a tragic love story, and then it goes into revenge, and he comes very close to a darker magic and black magic, and we see that in those stories, oftentimes the Mouser is very often the one who is more tempted by darker things and darker powers. So you can You have these, like, obviously in their appearance, and one is like this light skinned northern barbarian, the other one is smaller and darker in appearance. And Fafhrd, the driving, not the driving force, but the one thing that like moves him to adventure is oftentimes this more or less realistic notion of chivalry, whereas for the Mouser it's the temptation that kind of drives him to do stupid things and that's thus get into adventures is oftentimes a more darker curiosity and drive for power in a way. And we see those seeds being planted in the Unholy Grail. It's another good story. Um, yes, it's another a good story that actually establishes the character of the Mouser as like an individual in comparison to later situations where they almost always are together in a good way. Now we come to Ilmet in Lankamar, and that one I think is one of Leiber's finest works, and definitely one of, like, it's probably not my favorite Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's story, but it might just be the best one. By which I mean, I have a different one that's my favorite that has flaws. This one is just executed in an amazing way. The setup is good. The we see them like meeting for the first time. It has all the adventure stuff in there. We're going to talk about adventure, the idea of adventure, and the influence of Fritz Leiber and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser on the tabletop role-playing industry and tabletop role-playing as a genre, and thus feeding back into fantasy fiction. We'll talk about that later on as well. So we have all of that in there. There's elements in there that anyone who's ever played Dungeons and Dragons will recognize as very much familiar. The reason that for that is obviously that people who invented tabletop role-playing stuff like Dungeons and Dragons were huge fans of Fritz Leiber's work and had read those stories. So those things subconsciously or consciously like flowed into the genre. So we have those two young thieves in Lankamar, the biggest city of Newon, and they tussle with the Thieves Guild, and will more or less because they're exuberant youths, and then weird things happen, and not all of them are good. But you could guess because the thing is called ill met in Lankamar, not well met in Lankamar. But it's, as I said, it's the story about Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser meeting and forging their friendship and brotherhood. So that one, if you only want to read one of those stories in this book, that's the one you should go for. You don't need to read the character like origin stories of those two others of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. They are well enough established in this story, but obviously they are good stories. I'm not saying don't read them. I'm just saying if you only want to read one of them, read Ilmet and Lankamar. I think that goes for the entire series. If you only want to read one Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story, read Ilmet and Lankamar. That one is just near perfection when it comes to sword and sorcery, fantasy, set in a big city with all the elements that you find later on. It's like, let's just face it, without Fafhrd and Grey Mouser and this kind of thing, there wouldn't be any Gentlemen Bastards, there wouldn't be any Discworld, and so forth. So yeah, go read that one from the first book. All right. Swords Against Death is a collection of more stories held together by short vignettes that kind of make sure that all those not previously published novellas, novelettes, and short stories make this arc, this long ongoing arc of Fafhrd's and Mouse's life and how they live together. So we, even though the first actual story, like larger story within this book, which is Two Sword Adventure, that first published and first professionally sold story of Leiber's ever, is here like the first real story in this book. There's a small vignette kind of thing that, on a rather like distanced level in a way, kind of fills in how we get from Ilmet in Lankamar to Two Sword Adventure. That vignette, yeah, it's just, this like bridge thing between those two stories. Two Sword Adventure is Well, it's a fairly straightforward adventure story. It's a good one. It's a well-written one for like a debut story in a way, debut at least sold story in a way. You have two adventurers who have found a map, a mysterious map that speaks, and not map actually, like a parchment with a text on it, and they found that, and they've decided to go for the treasure of which that parchment speaks, and they do that. There's other people who have found, who've heard about that treasure and try to get it as well, and there's also obviously a hidden catch to the treasure idea. So yeah, that's the basics. I'm not going to tell you how it works because there's obviously twists in there. But it's a straightforward story in the way like when you look at Conan's The Tower of the Elephant or whatever, those kind of things. It's like they find a map that speaks about treasure. They go and try to get the treasure, and obviously one of those things about these kinds of adventure stories that you have here with Conan, obviously as well with like the Sword and Sorcery hero, even though sometimes he gets a lot of riches, it's vital that they lose that money real soon so they can have a reason to go out again to find more treasure or do more stupid things to get rich again. So anyway, that's one of the stories within the swords against death, which is definitely one that I say, yeah, it's not Leiber's best work, but it's a very solid story if you want to look at that. Then yeah, why not use that one? Which ones else in this story I would recommend? There's the Sunken Land, which is like, sort of influenced by Lovecraft in a way, and is a decent horror story, more like darker horror-y story in a way. There is that, I guess, like my favorite one in here, apart from that, even though it's not a really good story, is The Price of Painties. It's near the end of that book, and it deals with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser still dealing with the memory and with the grief of and loss of two very important women for them, and what they are willing to do to actually get there. And it sort of introduces elements that are becoming interesting later on, are also hugely influential, because it introduces death as a character in a way. It also not introduces, but gives room for people like Sheelbar of the Eyeless Face and Ningobel of the Seven Eyes, to magical beings that are kind of recurring characters in this whole setup. We have that one in there. We have the story of them dealing with not death, but some other character like the Bleak Shore, which, yeah, is also decent, but not something super special. Oh yeah, right. We have Thieves House. That's another one that, while not being perfect, is also hugely influential. If you read Thieves House and Ilmet and Lankamar, you see where Terry Pratchett gets most of his stuff from, like most of his Ankh-Morpork stuff from. It's a good story. It's also more heisty than others, so yeah, why not? That one is also really cool. The Bleak Shore, okay, there's a lot of stories that Leiber writes that have really cool concepts, and to me sometimes feel not fully fleshed out in a way. By which I mean, you have these really cool scenes, and then suddenly it's like a large part of the plot being sort of summed up in very distant, kind of short language, where it's like, a more like contemporary writer would probably flesh that part of the narrative out much more with more scenes and stuff, not just like summed it up basically. The Price of Painties also suffers very much from that. Prince of Painties, Price of Pain, I keep forgetting. Anyway, that one. Also, yeah, that also suffers from that because it has this amazing opening which is like, it's just brilliant. It's like Fafhrd and Grey Mouser are drunk and decide to steal a nobleman's garden house. So they go and hire other drunk people to carry that thing to a different place out of his garden and decide to live in that. And if that doesn't sound like your D&D, your Dungeons and Dragons adventurer group, then I don't know what does. Anyway, and then they get haunted, and then they have to do something to get rid of that haunting. And then the whole thing takes a very short turn and twist, and then from there on, it's just like, and they go there and they do this thing, and then we're basically done. So the setup is more than like 2/3 of the story, I guess, which kind of gives it this kind of lopsided feel in a way. So that's why I'm saying it's the opening part is definitely one among my favorite Fafhrd and Grey Mouser moments. The ending, not so much. Another thing that we kind of kind of realize by now is that there's a kind of philosophical bend to a lot of these stories that have almost like metafictional elements that become stronger in later editions, not later editions, later installments, with the introduction of people like Death, and Death being an actual person within the universe of Neon, and I'm dealing with that kind of thing. So yeah, that's something that is important in, I would say, in Swords Against Death. I would say read the first one, Two Sword Adventure, read Thieves House, and go read all of it if you enjoy them. But if you only want to do like a couple of them, then go with Thieves House and Two Sword Adventure, and that last one, Prince of Painties. Oh, and the Bazaar of the Bizarre is also in here. And Bazaar of the Bizarre is, it's one you should try. It's also very much peak Liber in a lot of ways. It has this weird, slightly decadent feeling. It shows a lot about the, character interplay between those two heroes, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which is definitely a general strength of these stories, that we have like two heroes who sometimes Liber calls like two sides of a coin, or like two pieces of a larger half. That kind of comes from the point where he read Joseph Campbell and then got into the whole idea of the one hero, and there's obviously also like kind of echoes with the Eternal Champion myth kind of thing from Moorcock, but anyway, that's not so important right now. But anyway, the character interplay is just very good, and the Bazaar of the Bizarre is basically the Mouser is drawn into a situation because of his curiosity and because of being quicker than the other guy, Fafhrd, and then Fafhrd has to drag him out of there. So that's that. There's also definitely a kind of political message in there if you want to read it as a metaphor. Yeah, you can read it as a metaphor, and then there's a political message in there, which also is interesting to see that Liber showing that, yes, sword and sorcery can be more than just people swinging swords and fighting wizards. There can be depth to that. So yeah, the Bazaar of the Bizarre is definitely one that you should also check out. It's also rather, as I said, they're all like not like short stories / novellas. They're all rather easy to read and quick to read. Swords in the Mist is the next one. Swords in the Mist has my favorite Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story, and the fact that this is my favorite one will tell you a lot about me and my reading habits if you read it. And that is Lean Times in Lankamar, and that one is just so good, so much fun, so irreverent on so many levels. It's just incredible. It starts with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser being in Lankamar and having something of a falling out. It's never quite clear. It's like also told differently from some of the others. Like it's more told like the narrator is slightly more distanced. The language is slightly more ironic. And so like it is said that once at some point they broke up. It's more like told like a tale is told to you, not like just like things happening. So just keep that in mind. And it's about them having their falling out, and Fafhrd becoming the acolyte of a priest of Isek, of the Jug, of a god. And it deals in a very irreverent way with religion in Lankamar, and thus with religion in general. And yeah, let's just say that this is very fun, because at the same time the Mouser hires on as a paid thug for a crime boss whose job it is, or not whose job, but whose racket it is, to gather protection money from priests in Lankamar. And you see, like, with both being very good at their jobs, obviously, the fame of Isek of the Jug rising with Fafhrd as his acolyte and bard singing for him and all of that stuff. And on the other side, Mouser rising in the ranks of that crime organization, and you can already see that at some point there will come the situation where the Mouser would have to go to the temple of Isek of the Jug, well, not temple, but, you know, go to Isek's priesthood and try to get protection money from them, which Fafhrd will obviously not like. And the way this is all, like, comes together is just so ridiculously good and speaks so much about, like, has a lot of cynicism about religion. And I guess by now you know that I'm very much interested in religion and faith in a way. It's brilliant. It is a lot of fun. It's brilliant. It has darker meanings in there. It's just like, if you want to read one other Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's story after Ilmet in Lankamar, it will be, like, if you listen to me, that is, it would be Lean Times in Lankamar. That's just like, you know, that's probably one of the best sword and sorcery stories ever written. It's just so good on so many levels. Go read that one. It's just, that's perfect. It's not perfect, but brilliant. Yeah, Swords in the Mist. What else is in that book? I need a thinking sip, I guess. Yeah, there's like that one, Seeking When the Seeking's Away. I personally find that one not so good. It's another one where things bend to the slightly erotic, which some of those Fafhrd and Grey Mouse's stories do in weird ways, and those are not always my favorites. And that's not because I have an issue with, like, romance, relationship, or whatever in fantasy stories. They can be done really well. I just feel sometimes slightly uncomfortable with the way Liber is handling that kind of stuff in these stories. But this one is not bad. Like, this one is not bad. It's just, I don't know, the whole plot isn't too, like, brilliant or whatever. Doesn't, you know, get me too much. I just don't like it that much. Yeah, there's another one in there that at the end, that's Adept's Gambit. I really enjoyed that one for several reasons. And Adept's Gambit takes place in our world. In 2nd century, like, BCE at this point, like in 2nd century BCE, Tyre, and because for whatever reasons, by accident, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser have stumbled through Ningobel of the Seven Eyes cave and entered the cave through one entrance and exited through another one, and now they're stuck in our world and they have an adventure there. That adventure is really cool. That adventure is just well done sword and sorcery. It also has probably the best dialogue of the entire Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series at one point, where Fafhrd and Grey Mouser talk to Ningobel, and it's just so over the top, overdone. It's just great. I'm not gonna, like, dramatically read to you, obviously, but that part is just like when Ningobel is waxing, he's like very loquacious all the time and speaks in like all this like elaborate language, and Fafhrd and Grey Mouser are always super bored and want to get things out of him quick, the information out of him, and they're interrupting him all the time, and he's like getting more and more angry. It's just like, just really well done, on point dialogue scene, just like brilliant. Apart from that, yes, they are traveling towards the Hindu Kush and have to deal with dark magic. What else do you expect? That one is also just really cool. Those would be the two big ones from Swords in the Mist I would recommend. There's another one I may have forgotten that is called Claws in the Night. I'm not quite sure if it's in Swords in the Mist or if it's in Swords Against Death. I think it might be Swords in the Mist. That one is also just like very competent and good. There's, as I said, there's always these small like vignettes in between that I don't, rate on their own here, because I feel like if you're reading the series, read them. They're good. Some of them are actually excellent, but most of them are just like too short to make sense on their own, I guess, for me. Anyway, Swords and Wizardry. Oh, I might have just switched up things, and Adept's Gambit might have been in Swords and Wizardry, or I'm confused, which is possible. Anyway, Swords and Wizardry has one large story there, and that is Stardock. And Stardock has these other stories around it. Stardock is about climbing a mountain and what happens in there. Basically, the entire story is about climbing that mountain. It takes up some kind of like motifs and ideas that were there before in Two Swords Adventure in a way. Anyway, there's rumors that some fabulous jewels are on top of the highest mountain of Newon. So obviously our two friends decide to go there and get that shit. Do they or do they not? We'll see. It's definitely worth a read. It's just well done. And it shows that you can actually set an entire story make an entire story about climbing a mountain and make it actually work and interesting. So that's definitely one of the highlight stories as well, I would say. What else is in there? The Two Greatest Thieves of Lankamar. I find refreshing. It's definitely one I like. It doesn't have that many points to it, I guess, but yeah, it's definitely a fun story, and shows definitely some of the character, shows more character of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and so yeah. I feel like I have forgotten one story I really wanted to talk about. I hope that's not the case. So what else? Are we already at the Swords of Lankamar? I do believe we are. Yeah, I think actually Adept's Gambit might have been in Swords, might be in this Swords Swords and Wizardry, probably. Anyway, The Swords of Lankamar is a full-blown novel, and as such has some really interesting elements. You can tell that it's written later in, at least the interesting, like, not, but at least the main part is written later in Leiber's career. Some of the elements have become more excessive, more pronounced, I would say. The satirical elements of the decadence of Lankamar, of its overlord, has become more pronounced. Some of the fantasy elements have become more pronounced, I would say. And it has some of the weirdest, like, weird shit element in the middle. Not in the middle, but there is some terrible German jokes in there. Just saying, there's another, like, intrusion of other worlds into Newon in this situation. Yeah, if you feel if you feel up to that, then, and if you've like enjoyed the like stuff that came before, the longer stories in there that came before, then this one is definitely a good story. Is definitely a good novel. But it also shows that a lot of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stuff works better in like a rather like in a shorter narrative of a short story or novelette or novella or whatever. I guess that's what I want to say about the Sword of Lankamar. We're nearing the end. The next one will be Swords and Ice Magic. Swords and Ice Magic. gets rather weird, philosophical, and metafictional in a way. It begins with that one, the sadness of the executioner, where Death looks at his like ledgers and sees that he has to kill a certain amount of people, like take a certain amount of people from different walks of life. And then we watch like how he goes about that, and we realize that two of them, because he has to kill two heroes, and then he has to figure out how to kill Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and yeah. I mean, obviously, since this is not the last story, you can tell that they will survive, but the way it goes about, as I said, it's like we're getting into like the metafictional level, because we have this. There's like how to say, there are comments in there where it's very much clear that that Leiber is making jokes about how he has to write the story, and that they're and making jokes about narrative choices and so forth. It's a rather short, like it's more one of those vignette kind of things. So yeah, that's definitely fun to read. The entire book feels kind of like weird in a way, because it has a lot of those super short vignettes that were collected from other like magazines where Leiber wrote like a two-page, three-page vignette or something, and they are not very spectacular. As I said, this one is sort of transformative. It's rather late, from 1977, and it's interesting from a more scholarly point of view when you want to look at how Leiber as an author has changed and developed, and how his characters have developed and stuff like that. But the actual stories are rather, I mean, not too incredible, at least from what I from my recollection, how I found them. They're very much focused on Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser trying to get it on with girls, and sometimes failing, most of the time failing in this situation, and stuff happening there. At least in the first part, when you have the bait. There's Trapped in the Shadowland, which doesn't go anywhere really. There's Beauty and the Beast, which doesn't go, but it's like a 3-page vignette, so never mind. Then there's kind of interesting Under the Thumbs of the Gods, which is highly problematic, but is like, once again, I would say very influential later on, for like later, especially for Terry Pratchett in a way. It's like you have those we have 3 gods sitting around in the land of the gods, and they're like, we lack worshippers, and we have those 2 heroes who used to worship us, and they're no longer worshiping us, which sucks. And we lose power because no one else believes in us, and our 2 main believers have kind of forgotten about us. Let's do something about this. Let's torture them until they start believing in us. And then they torture them with I'm not going to go into that, but that's sort of that's the setup of the story. And if that doesn't sound like Terry Pratchett to you, then I don't know what does. And there's Trapped in the Sea of Stars in there, which is another one that is weird in a way, because the actual plot is negligible, I guess. It's like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are on a boat. They're following 2 sprites that should, like, if legend is true, lead people to treasure. And then they are like trapped in this like part of the sea, which is called the Sea of Stars. And then follow a lot of speculations about the afterlife and the physical cosmos, and what the world of Newon looks like. And then there happens a end of the story, and that's about it. So I'm not going to spoil. Maybe I could spoil that for you, because no, I don't want to spoil it. But anyway, that's a weird story, if ever there was one, in the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser cycle. And that's saying a lot. That's saying a lot already. But yeah, it's just kind of strange to have like most of it being like metaphysical speculation, basically, with still 2 slightly erotic scenes in between. Now we come to the Frostmont's Dream and Rime Isle. They're two novellas that basically make up a, like, kind of connect to each other and were actually published at some point as a single book called Rime Isle. And basically it's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser get hired by two women to find heroes and champions and come to their island, Rime Isle, which is somewhere in the north, because they need help against a sorcerer or something. They need help to save the island. So that's what they do. There's an ice wizard who then tries to prevent them from doing that. And we get some more sea adventures because there's a lot of boating going on in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser in general. And then they finally come to Rime Isle, and then we learn about the problem that Rime Isle has with that ice wizard and the terrible sea mingles. Like, mingles are usually this horse people, as you can tell from the terrible name. But in this case, they have gone to sea and they want to attack. Under the guidance of that ice wizard, they want to attack Rime Isle. And there's two gods. One of them is Loki, and one of them is Wotan. Yes, those two from our world, from Nordic mythology, have kind of gotten like stranded on Rime Isle for whatever reason, because the connections between worlds are kind of weird there. And then adventures continue. And I'm not going to spoil that. That novella is actually pretty cool, especially for this whole idea about faith, belief, and so forth, and how Leiber looks at Nordic mythology there. That's pretty cool. So I guess in the end, that one, or maybe the two, like the Frostmont's Dream and the Rime Isle, or if you just get that one as like one book, that one's pretty cool. Okay. We're coming to The Knight and Knave of Swords, which is the last book. Fafhrd and Mouser are older now and have kind of settled down with those two women on Rime Isle that kind of hired them in the first place. There's actually, stuff going on, and then there's two short stories, novellas, basically, 2 or 3, and then there's like a last final one called The Mouser Goes Below. Those first two are rather... Oh, and there's like the Smalls and the Stars. So those two shorter ones are each basically, one is about the Mouser and one is about Fafhrd. And they already pick up further like older themes in a way. And they're not bad, they're just not very good in a way, not like Leiber's best stuff is what I'm saying. Now you have The Curse of the Smalls and the Stars, which features again our 3 gods who try to fuck around with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. And then the final one is obviously The Mouser Goes Below, which is interesting because it also features death. And Death being forced to do something that he doesn't really want to do. But since Loki and Wotan are still gods, they have certain rights, and Death has to work, like, do their bidding in a way. And they obviously want the Mouser and Fafhrd dead. Do they succeed, or do they not succeed? I will not tell you. I'll just tell you that during that story, both Fafhrd and the Mouser have to come face to face with their past in a way, and stuff kind of wraps things up, which is good because it is the last of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. I found that last book, all in all, rather difficult, especially when it comes to that whole sexuality part again, because Fafhrd and Mouser at this point are old. Well, it's not said how old, but they're definitely very adult men, at this point. But their interest in very young girls is still in there, and that's kind of sometimes a bit awkward to read. It can be uncomfortable to read. So having this sounds like a really good way to segue from like a short wrap up of the stories into styles, influences, and other stuff, I guess. Okay. The style varies, and the themes kind of vary a little at least. Leiber's style is slightly ironic most of the time, a bit more distanced than what you get. Well, you get some of that in Clark Ashton Smith. You don't get it in Robert E. Howard, obviously. He's slightly ironic, slightly distanced. He is really good with dialogue when he wants to. His overall treatment is of the friendship on character development of his main heroes is very well done. It's very lifelike, probably because of its influence from the life. Oh, and I've just remembered which story I forgot, and it's in Swords and Wizardry, and it is The Lords of Cornwall, which I personally find rather long and tedious, but it's like the one story that actually has writing of Harry Otto Fisher in there. Maybe that's the reason why I find it tedious, but it's rather dark and sinister in a way, and yeah, it drags on. So yeah, not exactly important that I kind of forgot about it, but yeah. So there we are. Character development between those two friends, sometimes rivals. I guess you can kind of see that basically bringing the bromance into Sword and Sorcery, which is cool because on like it at first it basically makes like the precedence that you can have more than one hero within one story, like two like heroes on equal footing basically. So that's cool. The camaraderie and that buddy kind of comedy thing sometimes works really well. And compared to like the characters that people like Robert E. Howard or Clark Ashton Smith, and especially H.P. Lovecraft write, both Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are very, very three-dimensional, very faceted characters, with their motivations sometimes being very clear. There's a lot of reflection going on there within the characters and the narrator there. That's the big strength of all those Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, is the look at those characters, which obviously comes from Leiber being in a situation where he can put a lot of himself and observations on his friendship in there. So that's definitely one of the strengths. Now let's talk about the whole sexuality aspect. Now you look at Robert E. Howard, you basically have none of that in there. Yes, there's dancing girls and stuff like that, but you can tell, I mean, A, it's the 1930s, B, it's Robert E. Howard, who has a rather difficult relationship himself to like any kind of relationship, basically. And yeah, with what's his name, with Clark Ashton Smith, yeah, the same. It's like sexuality doesn't play a huge role. There's dancing girls, there's prostitutes or whatever, but we never get closer to that. It's just like kind of window dressings, I would say. With Fritz Leiber, it comes front and center. It's one of the driving motivations of his characters, is in the beginning love, and then just the search for pleasure, basically, and then maybe coming around full circle at the end, where they're also looking for a more stable relationship. What that means is that you get a lot of situations where either Fafhrd or Mouser are chasing girls. And I use the word girl here, especially for the Mouser, who seems to have an interest in women that are much younger than him. And that can be, I guess, somewhat awkward for people. I think I'm a rather insensitive blockhead most of the time, felt that near the end of the stories, when he's, I don't know, 50 whatever years old, and he's still like chasing 16 or 18-year-old fantasy people. I'm like, that's kind of weird to read, because you know that those characters are based on actual people, which kind of makes it a bit awkward, is what I'm saying here. So be aware of that. And but on the other hand, what it also shows is that Leiber has a rather complex view of the whole concept of relationships and sexuality. He has a rather like complex view of that, and realize that it's a driving force in a lot of human action and a lot of human life, and it's rather complex and faceted in a way. So that's the positive side of that. I'm just saying, be aware. He can be relatively explicit, gratuitous when it comes to the description of bodies. That's definitely in there. And if you feel awkward, if you don't want to read that kind of thing, then maybe reading some of the later Fritz Leiber stuff, later Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stuff, not the early stuff. That's pretty standard. But later on, it gets rather more explicit, I guess, in a similar way than Robert A. Heinlein got more and more focused on that kind of thing the older he got. Probably. Anyway, that's another topic. Then what else is in there? Yes, the older the characters and the writer gets, the more we get these musings on death, immortality, and the afterlife, which I found an interesting topic. I generally find an interesting topic because you can see how he, Leiber as a person, deals with these kind of things. His wife died. His first wife died relatively early, like 1961. When, yeah, and he struggled with that for a long time, is what I'm saying here. And to see how he kind of puts his personal struggles in a way into these characters, into their reflections, is something I appreciate a lot. Unfortunately, it sometimes becomes more of a metaphysical discussion and less of a story. So if you're into the story more for the action, then some of those later Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories can become a bit tedious, I suspect. Yeah. Now let's talk about the influence. What did Fritz Leiber invent? Well, maybe the term Sword Sorcery. Mostly, though, he's like the guy who made Sword Sorcery gameable. He came up with the idea of an Assassin's Guild. He came up with the idea of a Thieves Guild within Lankamar. He puts that levity in there as well, which is really cool. Like Lankamar being this already slightly over the top, super large city. Everything is corrupt and seedy in there. Yeah, the Thieves Guild, who is official. Like everyone knows where the Thieves Guild is situated, that kind of thing. He's like the first one who does that. He doesn't care about the economics and realism of that. He just wants that stuff in there because it's cool. And that's basically where you get the beginning influence on like people like Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, who come up with Dungeons and Dragons, who are huge fans of Fritz Leiber's writing. It's basically, when you look at Dungeons and Dragons and following fantasy games, it's basically the magic system from Jack Vance's Dying Earth, the Thieves Guild and Assassin's Guild, and all of Lankamar and the adventure stuff from Fritz Leiber. That's basically what you need. And then you put in some Greek monsters and shit in the monster manual, and maybe Cthulhu and some others from Lovecraft into the monster manual. But that's the basics there. Obviously, stuff like Conan as well, but I would say Leiber and Jack Vance are very, very basic for like elements that have become staples in fantasy games. And obviously, we've reached the point nowadays where a lot of people who write fantasy novels have played those games, or have played computer games that were based on those tabletop games, and those staples then kind of come back into fantasy fiction there as well, into fantastic fiction there. The other big influence that Fritz Leiber definitely has is on Terry Pratchett, who is one of my favorite authors of all time. Discworld is one of the best things that ever happened to fantasy or fantastic fiction. And obviously Ankh-Morpork is a homage to Lankamar. You read the first Terry Pratchett book, not the first Terry Pratchett book, the first Discworld book, The Color of Magic. You have the beginning, and they like the opening scene is Ankh-Morpork is burning, and you have two characters, like two heroes, looking down on the burning city. One of them is a small thief called the Weasel, and one of them is a huge barbarian called Bravd the Hublander. Now, Hub is north. The Hublands is like the Northlands in Discworld, if you don't know. And they are speaking like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and they're making jokes about the city burning and so forth. It's a homage. Also, you have this fantastic southern jungle country in Newon called Klesh, and you have the sort of exotic Africa, whatever continent, depending on what he just wants. They have jungles and whatever they are, and Discworld, and that's called Klatch, and you can see those Klatch, or however you want to pronounce it. So you see there the Fritz Leiber influence on Discworld is immense, at least on early Discworld. Later on, there's obviously other stuff in there as well, but on the early Discworld, the influence is immense, as obviously is the humor, because there's a lot of humor in Fritz Leiber. The dialogue humor is there. The rather irreverent look at the cosmos, at religion, at faith is there. You have the idea of death being an actor within the world and having to, like, being just one death, being just the death for this world. Like, there's, like, a lot of parallels and influence there. So that is probably the big one you see. I personally feel like Lankamar is also a huge influence on the Ruzistan in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Probably both through just being read, as well as through that whole gaming influence there that I mentioned before. And I think, what else? As I said, Fritz Leiber's influence is widespread in the way that he kind of bridges that time between the 1930s Sword and Sorcery pulp era, and bridges that kind of gap that you get through the Second World War in the 1940s, and bridges that and brings Sword and Sorcery into the post-Tolkien times, basically, while keeping it still more Sword and Sorcery, darker, down to earth, introducing more mature themes in there, and also putting in those philosophical things, the philosophical musings in there, the metaphysical, the metaphysical and the metafictional elements into that. That's the big contribution of Fritz Leiber, and I really, really love him for that. So yeah, I guess we've reached the point where we need to wrap this up. And so yeah, let's wrap it up. Yeah. Quick fact. Fritz Leiber, born 1910, died 1992, writes fiction from like the 1930s all the way to his death. Writes his first Fritz Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser story in 1939, his last in 1988. Those two characters are based on himself and his friend Harry Otto Fisher. They are much more nuanced and faceted than most pulp heroes. And the world of Newon is kind of a metaphysical construct later on, more widely, more deeply explored. The stories are fitted into a fictional character biography. Those were released in 7 volumes as the so-called Sword series that you can also get in 1, 2, 3 volume omnibus editions. The first one is Swords and Deviltry, which is the 2 prequel stories about the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and the story Ilmet in Lankamar, where they meet for the first time. You have then the continuing stories all the way to The Swords of Lankamar, which is a novel, and then those last 2 late books, Swords and Ice Magic, and The Knight and Knave of Swords, which deal with the end of Fafhrd and Mouser's careers. If you want to check out stories, I would suggest going in that order and just staying as long with those stories as you feel comfortable and entertained by them, which may just be until the end, or maybe at any time before that. Yeah, that's my advice if you want to get into it. If you want to check out just 1 or 2 or 3 stories, I would say read Ilmet in Lankamar, read Lean Times in Lankamar, and maybe read Two Sword Adventure, which is that really like first story ever written on Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. I guess that kind of wraps it up. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you actually check out this immensely influential, fantastic author that brought a lot of humor, ironic distance, and humanity, actual humanity. That's like the big thing. There's like his characters feel human. At least his two main characters feel very, very human. Into the fantasy world. And if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you owe it to yourself to at least read one or two Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, because that's where so much of it started. All right, that's it for now, and I'll talk to you real soon about something else, probably the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Until then, cheers.